September 12th, 1942. Guadalcanal. Just after nightfall, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Edson's student. The darkness on a jungle ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field, listening to the sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Somewhere in the black wall of vegetation below, 3,000 Japanese soldiers were moving into position. He could hear them. The crack of branches, the metallic clink of equipment, voices calling out in Japanese, not even bothering to stay quiet. They were that confident. Edson had 840 Marines, raiders, and paratroopers. Yes, but still outnumbered more than 3 to 1. The ridge beneath his boots was the last high ground before the airfield. If the Japanese took it, they would pour artillery fire onto the runway. The aircraft that kept the island supplied would be destroyed. The 12,000 Marines in Guadalcanal would be cut off, surrounded, and annihilated. Everything came down to this single strip of Coralán kunai grass. Edson turned to his men and the doctrine. They were exhausted. They had been fighting for 5 weeks, surviving on 2 meals a day, battling malaria and dysentery alongside the enemy. Many had not slept in 36 hours. Their uniforms were rotting off their bodies in the tropical humidity. Somi had lost 20 pounds since landing. Others shook with fever even as they gripped their rifles. He did not giveth them a speech about glory or country. He gave them the truth. Hold 1 more night, he told them. Just 1 more night. If we hold, we will be relieved in the morning. Then the Japanese came. What happened over the next 12 hours would mark a turning point in the Pacific War. It would shatter Japan's suspicions about American fighting spirit. It would establish the United States Marine Corps as the most feared ground force Japan would ever face. And it would begin a transformation in how the Empire of Japan thought about combat against American infantry. But to understand why this single night mattered so much, you first have to understand what the world looked like in the summer of 1942. Japan was winning. Not just winning, dominating. Dominating. In the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had swept across the Pacific with a speed that observers worldwide. Hong Kong fell in 17 days. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore surrendered in 70 days, with 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops marching into captivity, the largest surrender in British military history. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in 3 minutes. Burma fell. The Philippines fell. Wake Island fell. American and Allied forces had been beaten everywhere. The Japanese military had captured territory spanning 5,000 miles from the borders of India to the islands off the Central Pacific. Military analysts in Tokyo calculated that Japano controlled resources and population shot dwarfed the home east. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from India. The greater East Asia prosperity sphere was becoming reality. More than territory, Japanese commanders had won something equally valuable. They had convinced themselves that Western soldiers simply could not. This was not mere propaganda. Japanese officers genuinely believed it. They had watched British troops surrender by the tens of thousands at sea, many without firing a shot. They had seen American forces on Button hold out bravely. But ultimately, after months of starvation and disease, they had studied their own infantry performance in China, where Japanese soldiers had won victory after victory against numerically superior opponents through shock, speed, and willingness to die. The conclusion seemed obvious. Asian soldiers possessed spiritual strength that Westerners. The Bushido Code, the warrior tradition stretching back centuries, gave Japanese troops an edge that no amount of American industrial production could overcome. 1 Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. This was simply accepted as fact by officers who would stake thousands of lives on the assumption. Japanese military and disbelief with analysis that bordered on fantasy. American Marines were described as prison inmates given the choice between combat ending. They were depicted as undisciplined, poorly trained, unlikely to break under pressure. The few thousand Marines on Guadalcanal were estimated at 2,000 men, maybe less, poorly supplied, demoralized, ripe for destruction. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo operated on these assumptions. When planning the recapture of Guadalcanal, they allocated forces that would have been adequate against the weak garrison they imagined. They never considered thought reality might be different. This assessment was wrong in almost every particular, and one man understood exactly how wrong it was. Major General Alexander van der Raft, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had no illusions about his situation. His Marines had landed on August 7th with 17 days of ammunition and food. The Navy had pulled out after heavy losses at the Battle of Savo Island, leaving Van der Griffers isolated on an island. Japanese aircraft bombed Henderson Field daily, flying down from Rabaul in formations that see. Japanese warships shelled the perimeter nightly, their 14-inch shells, turning the night into a nightmare of explosions and fire. Japanese reinforcements poured onto the island via high-speed destroyer runs that the Americans would come to call the Tokyo Express, delivering fresh troops under cover of darkness. Van der Grift's men were hungry. They were sick. They were surrounded by an enemy that grew stronger every week, while their own supplies dwindled. The situation, by any rational military assessment, was but Van der Grift also knew something the Japanese did not. He knew what Marines were actually capable of. These were not convicts or conscripts. Marine recruit training lasted 13 weeks, longer than any other American service. Every Marine received 147 hours of rifle instruction at Paris Island, nearly triple what Army soldiers received. Every Marine qualified as a rifle member learning any other specialty. This was not rhetoric. This was doctrine. Established after the Commandant discovered in 1899 that 100 Marines in the entire corps could meet marksmanship standards. Major Klauchheimer had been directed to take shooting seriously. The Corps had spent for decades doing exactly that. By 1942, Marine marksmanship was legendary. Qualification standards that would have marked an Army soldier as an expert really met minimum requirements for Marines. More importantly, Marines had developed something unique in military organization. Since 1934, they had trained specifically for amphibia, the most difficult military operation in existence. They had written the book on it, literally. The Tentativa Manual for Landing Operations published that year became the foundation for amphibious doctrine, not just in America, but worldwide. The Navy adopted. The Army adopted it. Even the British used it when planning their own amphibious operations. Between 1935 and 1941, Marines conducted 7 fleet landing exercises, working out doctrine for naval gunfire support, close air support, and infantry tactics against fortified beaches. They developed 20,000 Japanese soldiers against the Marine perimeter in the largest ground depot of the campaign. Lieutenant General Harukishi Hayakutaki, commanding 17th Army, personally directed the Japanese battleships bombed the airfield with 14-inch shells in the nights of October 13th and 14th, destroying half of Marine aviation fuel and dozens of aircraft. Japanese Olias attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinating their assaults through the jungle, in an operation far more sophisticated than anything previously achieved. The Marines held again. Over 3 days of combat, the Japanese suffered approximately 3,500 dead. American losses were under 300. The pattern established at the Tenaru and Edson was repeating itself across the entire perimeter. Japanese attacks were shattered against Marine firepower with kill ratios that defied everything Tokyo believed about infantry combat. By February 1943, the Japanese evacuate Guadalcanal. They had landed approximately 36,000 troops on Iceland. Over 6 months of 30,000 killed with thousands more dead from disease and starvation. Marine and Army ground forces together had lost around 1,600 killed in action. The myth of Japanese military invincibility died Guadalcanal. It died on the San Merritt, the Tenaru. It died on Edson's Ridge. It died in the mud and jungle around Henderson Field, and Japanese commanders knew it. What Tokyo understood, and what took the rest of the world longer to grasp, was that Guadalcanal was not a fluke. The Marines had developed a way of fighting that the Japanese could not match. It combined rifle marksmanship, small unit tactics, and devastating sporting fires into a system tattooed through bonsai charges like Humiat grinder. The key innovation was Thafir team structure. Marines had developed in the years before the war. Captain Evans Carlson had observed SA through Army in China and brought back ideas about small unit organization that the Corps adapted for its own purposes. By January 1944, Marine infantry squads consisted of 13 men, organized into 3 fire teams, or 4 men each. Each fire team contained a leader, an automatic rifleman carrying Browning automatic rifle, an assistant automatic rifleman, an arrow. This meant 3 automatic equipments per squad. Army squads of the same period carried only 1 Browning automatic rifle. Marines could generate at 3 times the automatic weapons fire rate, the squad level, the basic building block of infantry combat. The difference metered in the closer-in fighting that characterized Pacific Island combat. Concentrated automatic fire was a Marine squad could suppress an enemy position while maneuvering against it, using 1 fire team to find the enemy and 2 to attack from different angles. This flexibility had been designed for amphibious assault, where units often landed fragmented and had to operate independently. It proved equally valuable in jungle warfare where larger formations could not maintain. The war in the Pacific had changed. The question was whether Japan could adapt. The answer came over the next 3 years, written in blood-acrid islands, whose names would become synonymous with Marine sacrifice. Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Okinawa. Each campaign demanded more than the last. Each forced both sides to evolve. At Tarawa, in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division assaulted Batayo Island, a fortress of concrete bunkers and coconut log barriers defended by nearly 5,000 elite Japanese naval infantry. Rear Admiral Keiji Shiba, the Japanese commander, had built what he considered an impregnable position. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Underwater obstacles blocked landing craft. Heavy guns could reach any point where invaders might land. Boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take Taro in 100 years. The Marines took it in 76 hours. The coast was appalling. Nearly 1,000 Marines died, many of them winging hundreds of yards through chest water under machine gun fire, because their landing craft could not clear the coral reef. A rare tidal condition called Anapogi neap tide had reduced water depth over the reef to barely 3 feet. grounding Higgins' boats that needed 4T to pass. Only the LVT amphibian tractors could cross. Everyone else had to wait. Morethan. 2,000 additional Marines were. The beaches were littered with bodies. But when it was over, only 17 Japanese soldiers from the original garrison had survived to surrender. That meant 4,500 Japanese had been killed in 3 days of combat on an island smaller than Central Park. Shiboseki himself died on the second day. Killed by naval gunfire from American destroyers when he attempted to move his command post. His prediction about 1 million men in 100 years had been proven wrong by 18,000 Marines in 76 hours. Colonel David Shoup, who commanded the assault and continued directing operations for 36 hours after being wounded in both legs by shrapnel, received the Medal of Honor. First Lieutenant William Hawkins earned the Medal of Honor posthumously for single-handedly destroying multiple pillboxes on the first day. Shoup himself said that it was not often you could credit a first lieutenant with winning a but Hawkins came as near to it as any man could. Colonel Merritt, Edson, now serving as Division Chief of Staff, came ashore to assess the situation, and Latour observed that Marines had paid the stiffest price in human life per square yard at Tarawa than any other battle in court history. 4 Medals of Honor total were awarded for the battle shocked the American public when casualty footage reached home, but it proved that fortified islands could be taken by direct assault, and it taught lessons that would save lives in campaigns to come. At Peleliu, in September 1944, the Japanese unveiled a new defensive doctrine that would make Guadalcanal's Benzi charges seem almost merciful in Colonel Cuneo Nakagawa commanded roughly 11,000 defenders on an island of coral ridges and natural caves. Rather than waste his men in frontal assaults, Nakagawa placed only a single battalion as a delaying force on the beaches. His main strength hid in more than 500 caves carved into the marble ridges, which Marines would come to call Bloody Nose Ridge. Major General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, predicted a rough but fast battle lasting perhaps 4 days. It lasted 73 days. The 1st Marine Regiment suffered such catastrophic wasty that it was rendered combatant and had to be withdrawn. Some rifle companies lost over 60% off their men in the first week. The tactics that had worked at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, suppressing enemy positions, and then destroying them, failed against defenders who refused to show themselves until Marines were within grenade range. Nakagawa held out until November, sending his final message on November 4. "Our sword is broken and we have run out of spears," he reported. Then he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. He was posthumously promoted to Lieutenant General. American casualties at Peleliu exceeded 8,000, including more than 1,500 killed. Japanese losses approached 11,000, with only a handful surviving Tobakum prisoners. The lessons of Peleliu spread through both militaries. The Japanese had found a way to multiply the effectiveness of their defenders. The Marines had found that their existing tactics were no longer sufficient. Both will apply what they learned to the battles still to come. By 1944, Japanese military doctrine was undergoing a fundamental shift. The lesson of Guadalcanal, confirmed at Tarawa, could no longer be ignored. American Marines were not soft. They were not on the SIP lined. They were not going to break under pressure. Banzai charges, the massive infantry assaults that had worked in Sina and across Southeast Asia, were simply feeding men into a killing machine. Lieutenant General Tadami Kuribayashi was perhaps the first Japanese commander to fully absorb this lesson and act on it. Assigned to defend Oima in June 1944, Kuribayashi brought initial qualifications to the task. He had spent time in the United States from 1928 to 1930, traveling extensively across America. He had visited Detroit and observed American industry. He had studied American military thinking. He understood his enemy in a way few Japanese often. More importantly, Kuribayashi had studied Tarawa with professional intentness. He knew that clinging to the myth that American infantry had no stomach for close combat was, in his own words, foolhardy. The Marines had overwhelmed a heavily fortified special naval landing force in 3 days. They had waded through fire that should have stopped them cold. They had taken casualties that should have broken them and kept attacking. Anyway, Kuribayashi concluded that everything about Japanese offensive doctrine needed to change. No more beach defenses. The Marines' naval gunfire and air support made coastal fortifications death traps. Positions on the beach would be destroyed before the enemy even landed. The defenders would pull back inland into caves and tunnels where American firepower could not reach them. No more bonsai charges. Every soldier who died in a pointless frontal. Requirements for landing craft that could carry troops directly onto hostile shores. They trained naval officers to coordinate bombardment within. They learned through painful trial and error what worked and what got men killed. No other military in the world had invested this kind of effort into storming defended shorelines. The Japanese were about to discover what that training produced. The first test came on August 21st, 2 weeks before Edson's Ridge. Colonel Kanao Ichiki led 917 elite Japanese soldiers across a sandbar at the mouth of the Elu River. Misidentified on American maps as these were veterans of the China campaigns, hardened troops who had never known defeat. Ichiki himself was a decorated officer with years of combat experience. His regiment had participated in the conquest of Guam. They expected to sweep through the American lines in a single night. They attacked at night, screaming. They were absolutely certain they would shatter the Marines, as they had shattered every other enemy they had. The Marines were waiting. They had dug in along the west bank of Tarawa. Machine guns covered the sandbar from multiple positions. Riflemen had registered their weapons on likely crossing points during daylight. Barbed wire stretched across the approaches. The position was not elaborate, but it was prepared. When Ichiki's men charged across the sandbar in the darkness, machine guns opened up from 3 tracers cut through thick formations. Riflemen fired with accuracy that hundreds of hours on range had built into muscle memory. The Japanese charge slammed into a wall of fire and disintegrated. Wave after wave came forward. Wave after wave was destroyed. Bodies piled on the sandbar until the Japanese who followed had to climb over their own dead. By dawn, though carnage was total. M3 Stua light tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion rolled through the coconut grove where surviving Japanese had retreated, completing the destruction. Merritt counted more than 800 dead Japanese soldiers on the sandbar and in the surrounding jungle. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors to prevent their capture, then shot himself. American losses were 35 killed. When reports reached Tokyo, staff officers surfaced to believe them. The numbers had to be wrong. Japanese soldiers did not die in those ratios. It was not possible, but it was possible, and it was about to happen again. The defeat of Tenaru was attributed to Ichiki. He had divided his force, attacking with only half his regiment, while the rest remained behind. Tokyo reasoned that a stronger force, properly coordinated, would succeed where Ichi had failed. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi brought 3,000 men through the jungle to attack from These, avoiding the coastal areas where Akikiki had been destroyed. His road took weeks to traverse, with soldiers shacking through tropical vegetation so dense that progress sometimes slowed Toa. Few hundred yards per day, many collapsed from exhaustion and disease bore, reaching the assault positions. His plan was sound. His troops were fresh compared to the Marines they would face, and he had chosen as his target Ridge, where Lieutenant Colonel Edson waited with his 840 raiders. Edson understood what was coming. Intelligence had detected Japanese movements. Coast watchers had reported the Tokyo Express delivering reinforcements. The ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field was the obvious approach for any force attempting to reach the airfield through the jungle. Edson positioned his men carefully. The 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion spread across a line roughly 1,000 yards long. They dug fighting holes in rocky coral soil. They cleared out fields of fire through the kunai grass. They registered artillery, coordinates on likely approach routes, and they waited. The assault began at 9:30 on the night of September 12th, with a Japanese and 3 destroyers shelling marine positions. Shells crashed into the ridge, sending coral fragments spinning through the darkness. As the bombardment lifted, the first waves emerged from the jungle. What followed was 12 hours of combat so intense that veterans struggled to describe it for the rest of their lives. The Japanese attacked in waves, hurling themselves at marine lines through the waist Ikonai grass. Officers led with drawn swords, screaming commands. Enlisted men followed with bayonets fixed, some firing as they ran, others saving their bullets for close quarters. Grenades sarked through the darkness, their explosions punctuating the continuous roar of rifle fire. Machine guns fired in towel. Their barrels glowed red. The gunners pouring water on the mecanismos to keep them functioning. Marines fought with bayonets when ammunition ran low, with knives when bayonets broke, with entrenching tools and bare hands when nothing else remained. The fighting was so close that men could smell their enemies, so dark that friend and foe were distinguished only by shape and sound. The center of the marine line buckled. A company of paratroopers was nearly overrun, its commander killed, its survivors falling back in confusion. Japanese soldiers penetrated to within 1,000 yards of Henderson Field. Some reached the edge of the airstrips before being killed. Edson was very aware, standing on an ammunition box in full view of the enemy, silhouetted against the flashes of artillery. He directed fire, repositioned units, and rallied men while we were close to breaking. His nickname was Red Mike, earned from a beard he had worn in Nicaragua. That night, he earned something more valuable. He earned the Medal of Honor. At one point, with the line collapsing and Japanese forces pouring through thick, Edson encountered a group of Marines, falling back in disorder. "Where you going? Demanded. "We cannot hold them," came the reply. Edson's response became legend. "By God, ya will hold. Now get back there and do it." They held. By 3 o'clock in the morning, on September 14th, the crisis peaked. Japanese forces had punched through the center and were pouring toward Tarawa. Edson had committed every serve. There was nothing left. The situation had reached the point where Major General Whittinghathy's command post later admitted it wasted only time during the entire Guadalcanal campaign that he doubted the outcome. Then, artillery arrived. The 11th Marines had registered their guns on the ridge during daylight. Now, in the darkness, they fired mission after mission onto the Japanese assault. 105mm shells tore through Thepic formations with devastating shrapnel sped through men advancing shoulder to shoulder. Blast waves through bodies. Through the jungle erupted in continuous explosions that turned the approach routes into killing grounds. The Japanese advance stalled, then fragmented, then broke entirely. Dawn revealed the scale of the victory. More than 600 Japanese bodies lay on the ridge and in the jungle below. Some counts reached 800. Wounded Japanese soldiers had been dragged back into the jungle by their comrades, meaning the actual toll was probably higher still. Marine casualties were under 200 with fewer than 60 killed. Kowaga retreated into the jungle with the remnants of his brigade. Many would die of starvation and disease in the weeks ahead, unable to be He had started with 3,000 men. He would emerge months later with a fraction of that number. The battle of Edson's Ridge, later called Bloody Ridge, was over. One word spread through both armies after that night. Among the Marines, it was simply, they had held against 3-to-1 odds in the darkness, with everything at stake. They had held. It was exactly what their training had prepared them to do. Among Japanese, the word was different. It was confusion. It was doubt. For the first time, Japanese soldiers had thrown themselves against an American position with a Verithan they had, and they had been. Sakon Lieutenant Hingiri Nui, an officer with the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company, recorded his thoughts in a diary. Fatwold survived the war. He had witnessed at the aftermath of both the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge. He had seen the Batisbold on the sandbar. He had heard the survivors describe the machine gun. Fire that seemed to come from everywhere at times. Their firepower had overwhelmed us, he wrote. We had put too much confidence in our charging power. Only after our superior firepower can compete with their superior firepower will the charging power of the Imperial Army win a victory. This was not propaganda forum consumption. This was a professional soldiers' privateers, never intended to be read by Anyon but himself, and it captured something profound. The Japanese were beginning to understand that their assumptions about American infantry were catastrophically wrong. Inui noted another revelation in his diary, one that challenged everything Tokyo believed about Marine strength. Based on wishful thinking by the Imperial headquarters, he wrote, Ichiki's force was divided up and dispatched to Guadalcanal with Smaller. The reality was that 12,000 Marines held the island. Japanese intelligence had been wronged by a factor of 6, but understanding came slowly. Tokyo was not ready to accept that its were being outfought by the Menthi, had dismissed as soft and undisciplined. More troops were sent, more attacks were ordered, more bodies spelled. Upon Guadalcanal, the battle for Henderson Field. In late October,